territory where, again, your business won't grow 3x a year, but it could probably grow 50 to 75% a year, more or less in perpetuity, because many categories of SME software have been around for a long time and they're going to be around for a long time. So thinking about the natural growth rate in your market and then thinking about how long, you know, the opportunity you have to build your company and just aligning that to the capital that you bring in, that's kind of really the point here. Third point really is around Net Promoter Score. I've talked about that with the FreshBooks example. Do not underestimate it. I think it's a critical metric. Invest in kind of getting, you know, real customer love. And you know, help your customers grow. And what I mean by this is, again, if I go back to the two things that an entrepreneur cares about most, it's finding customers and then getting paid by those customers. So if you have built a product that helps me save time, like, I don't really care. Whereas you've built a product that's going to help me grow my business, I care a lot. Last thing is, and this goes back to my point about evergreen markets, you know, good things just take time. If you think about some of the biggest SME software companies, they've been around for a long time. Zoho's been around since 1996, Basecamp and SurveyMonkey, you know, 1999, and so on. You don't have, you know, if you read kind of TechCrunch all the time, then you think like inside 3 years you're going to sell your business for $300 million. Sometimes that happens. More often than not, it doesn't. And, you know, with SME in particular, you really do have an opportunity to just hunker down and build a very meaningful business, but over decades, not years. That's it. Thank you very much. I think we're out of time, but if there's questions up on the board, I'm happy to take them.
What have I done? I put studio mode.
To kick off actually by saying, I think we need to say a big thank you to SaaStock for putting together such an awesome lineup of speakers, right? So well done to the SaaStock team. Really impressive stuff, and yeah, I hopefully live up to the standards here, right? So today I'm going to be talking about the growth engine that took Hotjar from 0 to $10 million in one straight line. But before we do that, I wanted to say hello, right? And this slide is not about me being an Apple fanboy, even though I am, but it's actually about the first moment where I kind of fell in love with what was going to be the thing I was going to work on for a long time. And no, it's not Apple's, but it's when I was actually 5 years old, so this gives an indication of my age. My dad bought this device. We were living in Australia, and he was using it for publishing. And I remember falling in love with the interface and falling in love with this idea of there's a device, and I'm on the other end.
It's really easy to download today, and there is something more for which to choose with 2.5 million available through the Google Play Store. These apps are going to play a huge role in the way we live our lives today. Today we can access pretty much the entire Western canon of music and much beyond it too. Meet romantic partners, manage your diaries, documentation and payments, augmented reality apps are changing the way we interact with the world. And mobile gaming now accounts for a lion's share of game industry revenue.
Democratize the tools that I was using to do this job.
Apps played a part during the coronavirus pandemic, shaped 2020, helping to facilitate social distancing and contact tracing, for example. That has not to mention the crucial role that they played, allowing us to keep in touch with distant friends, family, and colleagues. Market for these apps is about as big as they come. It is estimated that the global number of smartphone users will rise to 3.5 billion over the course of 2020, and we looked at it in terms of devices. There are more connected mobile devices in the world, 2.94 billion, than there are people. These devices are approaching ubiquity in advanced economies, amongst which median penetration levels stand at 76% of adults in South Korea, with a stunning 95% of adults who own smartphones. Emerging economies are catching up. Brazil and South Africa already log penetration levels of 60%, while in the lower figure 24%, 0% under millions of users. Let's see how this is actually sounding with different volume levels.
I guess you're going to be disappointed if you're expecting that I'm going to be talking a lot about like maybe growth hacks or raising or whatnot, because we actually did this bootstrapped. And even though my background is in conversion and growth and all this stuff, I actually didn't get to use a lot of the things I know much so far. But yeah, let's jump into it. Before we do this, quick show of hands so you can get a better feel for the room. How many of you are here pre 1 million in ARR and in pre-traction, like in the beta stage? Okay, good presence. How many of you are after 1 million but before 10 million? Okay, good. So I'd like to share with you guys. And any of you post 10 million? Okay, a few. Good, because you're not going to get anything out of this. No.
Cool.
But yeah, it's a good time to look back, right? So yesterday, 10 million ARR, yay. And it's interesting to break it down. So for us, it was 9 months of that pre-traction beta phase. So it took us 9 months to build that up. It was 6 months in the initial traction. So it took us only 6 months to hit 1 million in ARR. And then it took us 24 months to complete the rest of the way, the other 9 million. And yeah, obviously we have no clue, but now obviously as of today, we're talking about 100 million, right? So that's the next milestone. But I thought it would be interesting to share with you one thing about this engine that we're talking about, which is what were the main factors that got us there. And the interesting thing, as I did a retrospective for this session, like looking back and seeing what actually happened, is that most of the things, so these are green dotted lines because they drove those green bars, right? So actually the launching and positioning and the building of the core of Hotjar that we did in those 9 months actually drove most of the growth that got us to 10 million ARR where we are today, right? Which is interesting. And so what did we do in the meantime, right? We weren't just looking and just logging into ChartMogul every day, right? So instead, what we were working on during the time is actually scaling up paid, which we're going to look at later on, which is one of our main channels that we used, and scaling for data. Because when you're ingesting data from 50, 100, 200,000 sites, that's kind of a big problem. So we've been very busy with that. But more importantly, what we've also been busy on a lot during our process of getting to 10 million is preparing for what's coming next, right? So I like to use with the team a lot this idea of you're sowing seeds, right?
17 positions to 7.
Today, when you see the 10 million ARR
Since our
results,
stats show
not something
40%,
we did.
Not 40 million years.
We worked on over the last few weeks or months. It's something that you set the trajectory for it a much longer time before.
Games accounted for 40% total app downloads
in on the fundamentals, operations, and ops is not
first half of 2020.
Company operations.
From 30% in 2019.
How do we share strategic objectives? How are we building up the team? Accountability. How do we hire? Build out the recruitment process. So we have been very, very ruthlessly focused internally. And that's why many of you probably haven't even heard about it.
Alright, so plan is going to be something like...
Have you heard about Hotjar before? Oh shit, yeah, you have heard of it. So maybe we've been focused more outside. That's good, that's good.
With the different technologies
so we've been preparing a lot for what's coming next. That's basically the main thing. And then as of kind of a few months ago, we've started working on the new architecture. So we're rethinking the way Hotjar is built. So the cogs and the pieces, which is again, going to make it possible for us to do the stuff that we're going to do much later, right? So going from 20, 30, 40, 50, and whatnot. And on the back of that, also rethinking pricing, which if many of you know Hotjar, it's not exactly something we nailed in the beginning. We're doing it right, though, so any changes we've always been doing, we're grandfathering, it's part of our culture. You see more about that later on. But again, it's preparing for that next phase. So the main thing you're going to take away from me today, and as we look at this engine that I'm going to break down, is that initially there was a lot of work that set the foundations for us getting there. I'm calling it the wave, and we're going to look at that later on. So what are the 5 critical components of this growth engine, right? In the title, I said the growth engine. So the first one is acceleration. It's this wave we talked about, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about how this wave made it possible for us to just hit that 10 million in that predictable straight line. Low friction. So from the very beginning, our background, the Hotjar team, we actually did B2C very successfully. So we've always been very kind of frustrated by enterprise friction, basically. So it's something that influenced a lot the way we built Hotjar. Efficiency. We're going to talk about the efficiency of the channel we used and how we made sure to stay efficient. The experience, which was a big driver in people talking about Hotjar and spreading the word. And finally, traction, right? So it has nothing to do with a mini, don't worry. So we're not going to be talking about vehicles. But yeah, I thought this was
It
a
works
cute
now.
way to kind of break it down, right? So let's go. So the wave, right? So we like to use this concept of a wave because you remember we looked at that 9-month period in the beta, the initial traction. That was the period for us where we said we're bootstrapped, right? So we used our funds to basically build Hotjar and take our time to do it. And it gave us this acceleration, right? So there was a lot of people using Hotjar, speaking about it, and it built, oh, there's a nice, I should avoid going there. It built this nice movement, right? It built this nice acceleration for us, which then later had quite a big impact. And part of that acceleration, how many of you actually heard of Hotjar when we were still at the beta stage? Okay, so some of you, so this would be new to most of you. So Hotjar actually came around where we came the idea, and rather than waiting, as I did previously in my failed startups, building up something for maybe 1 or 2 years, and then we're like, oh, yeah, there's no market for this. So instead, what we did was we actually said, we have an idea, we think it's fantastic, but what if we shared it with everyone as quickly as possible? And so if they would be interested in getting it, right? So we had this very simple notion, put in your email address, and you're going to be one of the very first people to use Hotjar. But then on the back of that, we created some great positioning, right, of why you should actually use Hotjar. And so the positioning piece definitely helped us a lot with acceleration because it allowed people to very quickly understand what Hotjar was. And then as soon as you do get in there and you're on the line, we obviously used our kind of knowledge of how to get people to spread the word, which is we created this waiting list idea, right? Nowadays you see this because it's kind of been a little bit used quite a lot, but back then this was relatively new. So this was huge for us. So we ended up getting around 60,000 emails, of which 18,000 participated in the beta, so it had a huge impact. And what started to happen during this time was we had so many publications, people write, not just about Hotjar, the tool and the positioning that we talked about, the value, but also about the way we actually did the waiting list and everything. So I would get replies to my emails. Ooh, we're getting a little bit more romantic. I used to get replies to my emails from the team saying, hey, Craig, check this out. We have to do this. So I was getting a lot of people by mistake replying to me instead of CCing the team. And it was interesting that just the way we even launched, the acceleration in itself was actually accelerating us. So I guess, even though it wasn't a traditional launch, but the way we kind of launched actually had a big impact. So we noticed that at that stage, this kind of spreading, the way it spread and the way it happened, definitely had a big impact for us. And you can see this also in tracking it, right? So if you look at Google Trends, it's interesting to see that period of time of when we look at that comparison of other tools to us that we did in our positioning, to see how we broke out of nowhere and within a period of just a few months, we took off very quickly. So the impact of that, I said, was that we had 18,000 users testing Hotjar, right? And so the impact from an acceleration point of view is not just visibility and people actually using Hotjar and talking about it, was also the ability for us to accelerate the testing process and making sure this product was battle tested really quickly. So all this data and the changes we made, the bugs that we collected, this had a really huge impact on us going forward. And we took the opportunity of not just doing the quantitative thing, right, but actually doing what we believe in. So every conversation we had with every user during this phase was recorded. We'd put down what they said. We'd act on their feedback. We'd get back to them if we made a change. So the acceleration was even more compounded by the fact that we took the opportunity to be persons, right? To actually speak to people, to take a note. These small details can make a big difference, and compounded these what we call wow moments, right? Someone saying, wow, I gave Hotjar an idea, and they actually then acted on it, and then they sent me an email saying thank you that they did it, asking me for feedback on that, right? So it's these small details that can make a big difference. So to summarize, we created demand quickly and early. We positioned ourselves in the market. Positioning is key. Highly recommend reading 22 Mutable Laws of Marketing, fantastic book. And then we also built this wave during the beta period. So number 2, low friction, right? So what do we mean by this? Very simple, right? We talked about the enterprisey, non-enterprisey way of selling software. We came from a B2C background, and we ourselves love to discover new tools and solutions and to quickly, right, just use them, see how they are, right? I think all of us feel that way. Yes, if you are in a big business, you probably want to speak to a sales team and get the exact explanation so you don't waste a lot of time doing research. But what we found was that the strategy based on what we know how to do best, so based on our background and our expertise, was actually to use the B2C model in the B2B environment, right? So we said, what if instead of selling to the executives, what if we sold to the teams, right? So what if we just created a low friction solution that any team can get their hands on it and then let them sell it to the organization. And that worked really, really well for us. So we still don't have a sales team today. We just have a newly formed CS team, which I'm actually heading myself. And yeah, it's happened over and over, right? So we have individuals that are huge Hotjar fans within really big businesses. So a few of them I can't even mention. Really big businesses where they have now 1,000 users on Hotjar and just one person sold it internally. Actually, in one really big business, I hate not being able to say the names, but this person actually wrote most of the documentation needed for us to close the deal himself. So it's like, it's interesting to see the power of that. So low friction, right? Especially for us. So yeah, it's very simple to create an account. Just fill out the fields. The plans, the pricing, super transparent. No complicated stuff there. But it goes beyond the site and the actual pricing and whatnot, and it comes also to the product itself, right? So we looked at the Apple in the beginning, so I'm going to do another Apple reference here. But it's the perfect example of, I love to compare like remotes in the past, right? And like looking at the Apple TV remote today. This is an example of low friction, right? Even though the last version is maybe a little bit more friction. But yeah, it's we kind of wanted to do this in Hotjar. Like I say this quite often, which is maybe an extreme, but my dream, in my head, I would love to see Hotjar to become like what is Netflix to our industry, right? What if I could just go in there and just hit play, and Netflix or Hotjar is telling me what to watch next, right? And so it's that simplicity which we're trying to strive for. And that translated itself into the product, right? This is what I was using before we created Hotjar, which this is just a tiny example, right? And how we then executed on that with simplicity. And while this looks simple, this took us, Jonathan knows, right? Weeks of iterating on this and tweaking. And how can we make it simpler, simpler, simpler? And it's still powerful, right? And that's part of the low friction, right? Just making it so easy for anyone to use, especially as we moved on from early adopters more into mainstream. We didn't want to create a tool that our early adopters could geek out on, but actually something that could scale, right? So this again helped us go to 10 million a lot, right? Because teams could spread and share it within very quickly. Another example of low friction is very early on we realized that we were actually quite big with agencies, and we weren't expecting this. So the whole business model was geared towards in-house companies. But what we found was that there were many marketing agencies where they worked with multiple clients who wanted to use Hotjar because actually the fact that you eliminate 6 tools and replace it with 1, if you're doing that with 10 clients as opposed to just yourself, is obviously compounded, right? So they went bananas basically when they saw Hotjar. They were like, oh, we love it. And when we saw this and we were like, oh no, we didn't prepare for this. So again, we ate our own dog food. We did a survey with these agencies to understand what they wanted to look for. And we spent a lot of time thinking about how we allow them to bring people, how we allow them to bring clients on board. We made it extremely simple. So an agency can quickly choose whether the client pays or they pay, and it's done literally with 2 clicks. So it's, again, another example of very low friction that an agency can just bring in a client super quickly. Don't need to speak to anyone, don't need to discuss pricing. It's all very simple and easy to do. And the low friction aspect also comes in other things, right? Such as the fact that we publish our product roadmap. So our customers don't need to stay guessing, right? Or they don't need to ask us and we reply. We just put it out there. Many people think we're insane because we're telling all our competitors what we're going to do. But hey, I think that's great. If anything, that means that maybe they'll end up following us, and that's a good position to be in, right? So, and similarly, the way we communicate these changes and the roadmap changes. So yeah, many of you have probably seen Nick's face quite a lot, right? But it's part of, again, communicating openly, transparently. So yeah, to summarize, we eliminated any barriers. We did simple and easy to use interface and transparent communication. So eliminating friction allowed that line to move nice and smoothly, right? So efficiency, this is where it starts to get interesting. a little bit more tactical. So as I mentioned before, we were very aware of what our strengths were and our weaknesses are, right? So we know the B2C environment really well, but when it comes to doing the typical sales and enterprise stuff, we had no idea how that worked. We had never done content really well before, although we love to consume content, but we had never done it. So initially we were like, okay, should we do content? Probably not, because I tried to write a blog post and it took me a month. So this is not going to work. Johan, you want to write a blog post? Yeah, I don't think I want to do that. So it was very clear, right? So what I'm trying to say is don't try and do a channel which you're not inherently, organically, naturally good at, right? Do what you're good at. And in our case, we had built a software business to tens of millions of dollars, and we had done that on the back of paid, right? So we leveraged that knowledge. So early on, we knew how to do Facebook advertising quite well, because I actually used to do parties quite a few years ago, so I'd done Facebook and I knew it really well. Ironically, it was the very beginning of Facebook advertising. So we leveraged our knowledge of messaging, of how to make ads much more like news-oriented and content-oriented and less kind of spammy. So it is paid, but it's not your typical ads, right? So in our case, we leveraged heavily our positioning and the novelty of Hotjar by talking about new and awesome tool, right? Value, which is going to change, highlighting the change happening. And this was extremely effective for us in this kind of land grab that we were doing. So we managed to spread very quickly. So this is what we focused on, especially in the first initial 9 months. And we also did email and community. So by email, we weren't spamming anyone, but what we would do is, since it was very crystal clear who we were building the product for, we could go to communities, such as, for example, Web Designer Depot, right? So we're focused on web designers. And we'd speak to them, listen, do you have an email list? Yes. Can we sponsor? Yes, right? So we'd take the messages that we had tested on Facebook and knew really resonated well, and then use them on email, right? So the tip there is, if you're going to do that, don't test on email, right? Because that's not the best place to do it. Test it where you can do it very, very agile and quickly, and then replicate that on email. And then communities, I mean stuff like Early Bird, Product Hunt. Product Hunt back then, that was just the real beginning of it, right? So we were lucky in that way. And then later on, as you can see, as we wanted to sustain growth, we then, even though we know Google search quite well, it took us quite long to actually start it because we didn't feel there was a need for it, right? So we're not doing growth just for the sake of growth, but we then moved, as the brand started to slowly develop, we started to move into Google search to do brand more, as competitors started to pop up doing ads about